Hi, this is Paul. Some of you might remember Ron Brown. I posted some of his baptism service in Tucson, Arizona, not too long ago. That was February 2022. And he recently sent me a video about, he's been doing some thinking about materialism, dualism, idealism, and the mind-body problem. Ron was a student of Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke at University of Toronto, and he lives in Tucson, and he was baptized in the Tucson Village, the Village Church in Tucson, which is pastored by my friend, was pastored by my friend Rod Hugan, and I have quite a few connections with that church. It's a part of the Christian Reformed Church, or related to the Christian Reformed Church. They've got an interesting relationship with the Christian Reformed Church. And so he had sent me an email and said, I'd like you to watch this video. And it was an interesting video. It's sort of a fourth way on thinking about the mind-body problem. But the video that really captured my interest was this video. I no longer trust Tim Pool and Dave Rubin. Why it's important to have friends who disagree with you. The thing that caught my attention was no longer trusting Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, partly because of the video I released yesterday on David Fuller. And someone in the comment section had mentioned, there's a lot of hate in the comment section for Dave Fuller. Some of that hate is because of some of his takes on COVID. Some of that hate is because of his association with mass media and establishment media, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And then one of you, and you know who you are, he's from the Chicago area, sent me a really delicious article. It's from the New Atlantis, How Stewart Made Tucker. And it's a very interesting piece in a lot of different ways. Sort of goes through the last 30 years of history of journalism and really made me think about collective relevance realization. To summarize a lot of the article, the thing is well worth reading. It's a fairly long article. What the article asserts is that what Jon Stewart basically did was show the way to unintentionally remake journalism. And journalism is, in many respects, collective relevance realization, or at least it purports to be, because what journalism does is direct our attention from here to there. It starts out with some late 90s issues, O.J. Simpson, Monica Lewinsky, Lacey Peterson, on and on and on. And Jon Stewart sort of rises to battle this. And what Jon Stewart was looking for was some objective news. Probably Jon Stewart is about my age and also from New Jersey. Objective news that would basically, he was looking for the old news days during the Cold War in which he grew up, which would sort of, well, here are the facts. Well, what is this news about? Now, my channel got started in many ways because in October, November of 2017, I was rereading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was about the news. And part of the quest of that book was, in his mind, to re-summarize it with some fancy Vervaeke words, the decline of collective relevance realization as expressed in journalism and the news. Now, what happened, and this sort of nicely goes through what happened, how the Daily Show sort of in its time, because of sort of the emerging technology that was happening, the Daily Show in some ways became sort of a meta news broadcast. Because they were comedy, they could always sort of shove everything off. We're on Comedy Central. This is a comedy program. But there was a very serious mission that Jon Stewart was on. 1999 was sort of peak news, okay, and it talks about that. I'll pick up reading here towards about two-thirds of the way through the article. The O.J. Simpson trial, the Monica Lewinsky scandal, the Lacey Peterson case, Crossfire, none of them made sense as events of public importance for great people, but they made perfect sense as great television. If you watched American Beauty, Fight Club, and The Matrix, and you know, it's amazing when you think about, well, maybe it's just my age. I remember all three movies were talked about significantly at that point, and all three movies have really endured in the collective consciousness, I think, to a high degree. American Beauty, not as much, but American Beauty, I believe, won the Academy Award. But Fight Club and The Matrix still sort of reverberate through our culture. If you watched American Beauty and Fight Club and The Matrix in the year of peak news, you probably felt that getting beyond this empty culture meant burning it down, replacing it with something brave, real, and true. But implicitly, this meant that it would have the same unified audience, the same mass audience, freed at last from slavery to soulless garbage. This was very much the mission of The Daily Show. The catch is that the mass and the garbage were one. The reason TV culture was so shallow is that it was imposed over everything that Trow called the grid of 200 million. That is the number of Americans when he was writing in 1980. The business imperative was to grab as much of a television audience, singular, as possible. All content decisions flowed over this imperative. Jon Stewart did not get this. He dreamed of a broad, hard-working, undeserved, middle of the country hunger for entertaining veracity he would produce. The idealized audience he often involved was the silent majority of fundamentally decent Americans who were turned off by political extremism and partisanship for the sake of partisanship. In a 2002 interview, he called this the disenfranchised center for fairness, common sense, and moderation. This might be a fair description of the 1999 broadcast TV audience, but it was not a description of Stewart's own viewers. Pew Research found that The Daily Show had one of the most liberal audiences of any show on TV, beaten only by Rachel Maddow's, and no show's viewers skewed more high income and high education. Roger Ailes did get this. Fox News' business model was not actually aimed at conservatives, but at newly deregulated cable. Ad-funded TV broadcast had rewarded achieving the big audience, the biggest audience possible. But the cable rewarded having loyal, consistent audiences that would clamor for access to their favorite channels, giving owners leverage to negotiate the highest subscriber fees from cable providers. In 2021, Fox Cable Division generated $3.9 billion in revenues from fees and only $1.3 billion in revenues from advertising. This business model meant cultivating ties with a particular niche, providing them content that they would find enthralling. Here's the relevance realization. And it's relevance realization in competition, collaboration, opponent processing with that which pleases us. When Fox News launched, American conservatives were the biggest distinctly underserved niche. But MSNBC and CNN would eventually follow in their footsteps for the same reasons. As so many other things, Stewart, because of why were the conservatives such an underserved niche? Because underserved, just those marketing terms. Because, of course, you had the cathedral and the academy, and this was of course, what the big three, ABC, NBC, CBS, all of their news, that was the mass culture that was predominated in the society up until the 70s, and of course in the 80s, cable news comes in. In so many other things, Stewart was a master innovator of what he claimed not to want, building a devoted niche audience, narrowcasting. When the mass audience produced by advertising melted away, the innovations in style and production that Stewart had pioneered were a ready-made answer for this crisis. They provided a template for how to be successful not with a mass audience, but with a loyal fragment by replacing the culture of mass media with meta-commentary on it, and the costly production of original news reporting with efficient repurposing of others' work, which is, of course, exactly what the Daily News did. And they always did it sort of with tongue-in-cheek and a wink in their eye when they're in front of the green screen, etc., etc. I'm old enough to have watched quite a bit of The Daily Show. Probably a lot of you didn't because, of course, it sort of went away as Trump came into view. And I don't know that that is necessarily just a coincidence, because in many ways, Trump sort of is the Daily Show made flesh in some ways. But even this description undersells what made the Daily Show unique, why it seemed to wax even as all other TV news waned. The real audience that sustained him assembled where all the audience assembled today, online. Stewart understood that converting a loyal audience into a media business success was not just about getting eyeballs in front of the set, the Friends model, or even getting people to pay every month, Patreon or Substack. It's about getting people to be personally loyal to you and to identify with your brand. You could tell Stewart understood this because of the way he used clips of his own show. In legacy television, you could never give away your content in a way that couldn't be directly monetized, from which you weren't getting a licensing buck or a bump in the Nielsen ratings. But The Daily Show just gave their stuff away. They knew that the internet would help build loyalty and eventually an audience that would make Stewart powerful. And I remember in the early days of Jordan Peterson, it was, of course, the clips that made Peterson powerful. He was a guy with 1 or 2 hour videos on the internet, but it was all the little clipsters on YouTube that really gave Jordan Peterson the propulsion. In some ways you think about if you ever taken a paper cup and filled it with gasoline and lit it, it doesn't explode. You just get the top layer burning off. You want to explode gasoline? Aerosolize it and whoosh, that's where you get the big explosion. And in a sense, that's what the clips did. The clips sort of aerosolize, and there's where you get the combustion that'll actually give the persona, the personality, the image through which we are doing and projecting our relevance realization out onto the world. The Daily Show was the first TV show whose clips regularly went viral via forwarding emails, discussion forums, and shared BitTorrent links, even as The Daily Show often had to send its interns to archiving services to pick up physical tapes of other shows. It was one of the first to host specifically shareable clips on its website, alongside full episodes. It was the first whose producers grasped how free clips online could drive, rather than cannibalize, viewership numbers. Stewart's appearance on Crossfire may have been the first piece of national political journalism to go viral online. It's Paul Begat, Tucker Carlson, and Jon Stewart. That's who was on that show. And you can find it on YouTube on a channel with 2.7K subs. And one of these channels, it's just serving up content. You put it on a little throwaway channel. It's got 16 million views. Just a tiny little channel, because everybody understands you don't subscribe to this channel. If YouTube decides it wants to take this away, or some copyright owner like CNN says, no, it can't be shown, goes away. All of this got underway before YouTube, whose first video was uploaded 6 months after the Crossfire showdown. The audience of The Daily Show, and eventually its offshoot, The Colbert Report, was significantly larger than what the TV ratings alone revealed. It was more personally loyal to Stewart and Colbert. It was an audience that shared clips, talked about them on Twitter and Reddit, and bought books. It was an audience that crowdsourced rides. Now remember, this audience is abnormally liberal and abnormally well educated. They are the audience of the cathedral. They are the ones that have the better internet access. They have the smartphones, or the early smartphones, the Palms and the Blackberries. And I mean, this is, of course, the iPhone comes out in 2007, which eventually by 2009, 2010 popularizes the smartphone, especially when the Android comes out with the Motorola. I had that phone, that first Motorola phone that really made Android sing. I had that phone. It was an audience that crowdsourced rides and crowdsurfed spots to show up on the hundreds of thousands for their satirical Rally to Restore Sanity and or Fear 2010. It was an audience that donated over $1 million to Stewart and Colbert organized Super PAC as a bit. And again, this is all sort of proto-normal when it comes to Tim Pool or Dave Rubin, or in this video a little bit later, he'll talk about some other guy that I had to look up because I didn't know who he was. This is all now normal, and it's basically what Jon Stewart pioneered. Contrast this with David Letterman's show. Initially a rival to The Daily Show, Letterman had a cult following, and you could buy his merchandise and books, but the point of all that was to get you to watch the show and to buy from advertising. Everyone who bought Letterman's top 10 books watched the show. But The Daily Show, you could just watch clips when someone shared them and not bother with the show. And I did a lot of that too. The books and the rallies weren't marketing gimmicks. They were the whole new ecosystem of which the show was just one format. It's hard to think of an earlier TV show that had such loyal following people who did not actually watch it on TV. Oprah had an empire, but her fans mostly watched her. Every show before Stewart's you could understand as a TV show, but The Daily Show was an audience first and TV show second. And in many ways, you know, I often talk about the difference between John the Baptist and Jesus. This is part of the success of Jesus. John the Baptist started a cult around him, a franchise that lasted, 2-3 centuries. But you could clip Jesus, and the Gnostics did it, and the Bible bookstores did it, and everyone did it, and you could have plenty of heresies, you could have plenty of this, you could have plenty of that. It just goes whoosh. You didn't just watch The Daily Show, you subscribed to its worldview. And you subscribed to its worldview through Stewart himself. He was the medium. And Alexander from Bulgaria sent me a nice email where he talked a little bit about what Peugeot was talking about in terms of sort of the human and the idealized human sort of becoming the identity construct through which we see the world. It's really personified communal relevance realization. And that's why you get all of these little NPCs in the world, and sets up the struggle to be a real boy and not a non-player character, to be authentic, to be truthful, to be, this then becomes the Jesus thing. Byrne sent me this on Twitter. This is from Laura Chen, just quoting somebody on Twitter. I have to believe that God delights in seeing us becoming our most authentic real selves, the actualization of the secret sacred self. Sexually orientations, gender identity, and all. I believe too, in fact, Scripture supports this since we are created good, and good is what we are. That whole Genesis 3 thing, let's just move that away. The more I expose myself to this theology, the more I believe it. It's been a long journey here, so I believe this deeply. No God of love in an evolutionary, dynamic, and ever-changing universe could possibly be otherwise. Yep, this is where my thought process is with it. How could we as humans love more than a God who made us to love? And our standards are higher than God's. then he isn't a God of love. But he is, so his love is much more than we can fathom. And so you see again we do our relevance realization through these. It might be through Jesus, might be through Buddha, might be through Jon Stewart. We do our relevance realization through sort of these idealized people, and a lot of this isn't terribly conscious. It sort of emerges from within us, let's say. At first blush, the idea of audience-sponsored journalism sound neither new nor worrying. Newspapers before the mid-19th century were partisan outfits run on subscription revenues, not advertising. In other words, it was audience capture by design. And surely news consumers have purer motives than faceless corporations do, especially if their support isn't even commercial but philanthropic, like supporting a Patreon public radio or the Atlantic. This intuition is wrong on two counts. First, having to sell content to audiences rather than selling eyeballs to advertisers transforms the incentives reporters face. Advertisers like positive stories that put you in the mood to buy stuff, while readers and viewers respond to more fear or anger-inducing stories. Other than on stories explicitly affecting their businesses, advertisers don't really care what the news says, but readers like news that confirms what they already believe. Just like viewers like people, internet avatars that are in some ways aligned with them, that they can identify with, and in some ways they can sort of participate in this idealized being of light here, manifesting to you maybe who you want to become, how to grow a beard. Subscribers are more likely to keep paying if they feel emotionally engaged with the individual journalists they sponsor, and so on. Second, there is a critical difference between the 19th century model and the audience-sponsored media today. You did still buy the newspaper in order to get the news. And while the paper might have offered a skewed interpretation of the facts at hand, all of the newspapers in the 19th centuries, of course, had their own biases and their own parties and their own narratives that they were sort of putting forth. It still needed to cover everything its rivals might, or else you might think you are not getting all the news that's fit to print. Today, few people are paying mainly to get news. On the internet, facts about what's going on in the world are available in copious amounts and with enough variety to suit any taste. Yes, serious journalists still report valuable stories and discover important facts, but where before this kind of public interest journalism work was subsidized by profitable fluff news, today it is heavily funded by grants. And this kind of reporting, while valuable, hardly gains the kinds of mass attention that it once did. Consider how little political energy has come from the astounding investigative journalism on the opioid crisis. So if you can no longer sell the news nor advertising, what is it that subscription-based journalism sells today? Worldviews, interpretations, and the facts that support them. Today, journalists sell compelling narratives that mold the chaotic torrent of events. This is exactly, in many ways, what Ron Brown is complaining about when he's talking about his new dissatisfaction for Tim Pool and Dave Rubin. And spoiler alert, he says some kind things towards Sam Harris. Today, journalists sell compelling narratives that mold the chaotic torrent of events, internet chatter, and information into readily understandable plot lines, characters, and scenes. And this is the way in which, in many ways, Donald Trump succeeds Jon Stewart. Because if there's something that Trump did effectively, it was that. I mean, he renamed all the characters that were on the Republican stage in the primary with him. He renamed Hillary Clinton. I remember when Trump came in and made immigration this massive issue, and of course, most of the cathedral mass media looked at that and said, immigration isn't an issue. Oh, it is now, because it's the person that we're following. So Jon Stewart didn't just bring about Tucker Carlson, he brought about Donald Trump. They do this by directing scarce newsroom resources to a handful of overarching stories which are built through standard newspaper reporting, essayist long-form installments, videos, podcasts, op-eds, and yes, reporters' tweets. Like Scheherazade, if they can keep subscribers coming back for more of the story, they will stay alive. The problem is not only that serious journalism cannot survive in the contemporary media business model, it is that in an era of subscription-based narrative production and superabundant facts, okay, here's combinatorial explosiveness at work. You've now got combinatorial explosiveness with respect to the news. And this is what Vervaeke and Peugeot are often talking about with respect to science, too. You have to select. You have to do relevance realization. And in fact, what we're doing collectively is collective relevance realization. And that's what the journalists are doing. And that's what I'm doing right here. Me too. What journalism gets produced and shared comes down to which stories are needed for different narratives. The trouble is not that misinformation is destroying facts, but that even if all of the fact-checking procedures are followed by a letter, facts only matter now as far as they are useful to monetizing a worldview. Now, that's a little bit cynical, and what it tends to cover is the reality that this is, in fact, how we filter, again, going back to Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris in the first Vancouver conversation. It's this a priori filter that we are filtering things through in order to reinforce the narrative, because you need a narrative to do that filtering for you. And you need the facts to support the narrative. And so you're constantly doing that, unless, of course, you have a transformation or a red pill or a black pill or a bread pill or some pill in which suddenly the narrative changes. And this is, again, in fact, what Ron is talking about in his video. But in terms of how it works in the market, well, it's the person who is embodying the narrative that is helping to lend the facts. Stewart's theory of what made Fox News so effective, that it was narrative infotainment for a loyal niche audience, took explicit form in the spin-off show he produced, The Colbert Report, launching in 2005. It featured former Daily Show correspondent Stephen Colbert in character as bombastic conservative pundit on the model of Fox News personality Bill O'Reilly. The premiere episode, Colbert's character proclaimed himself the emperor of truthiness. "We are divided between those who think with their heads and those who know with their hearts," he explained. Competition between head and heart? No contest. The point was offered the gentle viewer's smug assurance that they still lived in the world of facts, while the sheep over at Fox believed whatever felt right. To illustrate, Colbert used a clip of George W. Bush defending the nomination of White House counsel Harriet Miers to the Supreme Court. "I know her heart." But the quote was actually taken outrageously out of context. The punchline hit big, not because of anything brilliant Colbert had said, but because he understood exactly what his liberal audience already believed about the nomination. In calling out the scourge of truthiness, Colbert was being truthy. Then again, wasn't that what Stewart had been doing all along? Wasn't it even what he promised? What Stewart insisted on night after night was imposing his own context on the news, a narrative and a meaning he decided. And he could do this all from a comedy posture. He argued that good journalism needed to do this too, that there was no such thing as objective journalism. Postmodernity already on its way, except there are no faithful narratives, but my own. Because the powerful decision a journalist could make was to decide what was important. There it is, collective relevance realization. Wrapped in layers of irony and humor, Stewart had already been relying on truthiness for years, reflecting the incredulity and ire his audience felt about politics and media back to them. The dark secret of Stewart and Colbert's pastiche of conservative infotainment was that it only worked because their liberal audience wanted the same thing, adjusted for taste. Anyone can read the news to you. I promise to feel the news at you, for you, and with you. I added the last two. What Stewart and Colbert didn't realize was that they were prophets at the advent of what Audrey Meir calls post-journalism. The business model of mass media advertising was dying and subscription-based journalism was rising at its pace. The switch in business model would also mean the death of journalism's old neutrality norms and the need of new ones. Stewart and Colbert would pioneer them. While The Daily Show was helping to kill spin in the aughts, online political journalism was also forging the new coin of the realm, a consistent voice, a clear brand, authenticity, telling your audience where you were coming from, and a certain ironic detachment from a particular take. You could make fun of a journalist who posed as objective by exposing him as a partisan hack. It was a lot harder to generate comedy from a pundit doing exactly what you expected a pundit to do. Out of the advertising cataclysm, there are two newspapers that pivoted in time, and they thrived. The New York Times and the Washington Post managed to substantially grow their revenue by pivoting to a subscription-based model in everything that entails. In 2020, digital revenue overtook print revenue at the Times, completing its transformation to a self-described digital-first, subscription-first company. Since the new business model does not especially depend on daily newspapers, the Times and the Post are free to branch out and develop diverse ways at delivering content, including podcasts, documentaries, and magazines. The primary service provided its interpretation, laying out the puzzles, narratives, and the clues to the real story. In 2017, internal report of the Times operations concluded that it spent too many resources on editing and not enough on story sharpening. In 2020 job postings of a new Moscow correspondent, the paper did not require candidates to speak Russian. But it did lay out a paragraph length their official storyline about Vladimir Putin's Russia. In other words, you have a confessional basis for which to apply. Even for the hard reporting that remains, what is especially essential under the subscription model is narrative development. Because Stewart and Colbert were right. In the digital age, you didn't need anyone to read the news to you. What you need is to understand how you should feel about it and what the story what story it tells. For most readers, including many in journalism, the details will simply make no difference in their day-to-day lives. It's relevance realization. What they're doing. They're participating in what? The fight against the corrupting libs or progressives, or the obstinate conservatives that are keeping the eschaton from coming. It's our daily meditation. It's our daily quiet time in front of our smartphone. It's the religion of our age fulfilling the narrative and our participation in it. Well, if I read it, if I believe it, I can participate in it, and soon the glorious eschaton will emerge. For most readers, including many in journalism, the details will simply make no difference for their day-to-day lives. This is what Postman said. Presented with a massive overload of isolated facts, they will simply want to make sense to them. Sense-making. Helping them to do so is the most valuable, most revenue-generating function of journalism today. Find the most powerful story to build out carefully collected facts, building a compelling lattice of clips, reports, interviews, and takes that confirm your sense of everything of what's wrong in the world. More than anyone else, the journalism world today is aping Jon Stewart, the man who figured out how to spin boring, ubiquitous, superabundant media straw into engaging, titillating, pervasive narrative gold. In his dream, Jon Stewart flees the set of the show cast on his image of journalism, Tucker Carlson Tonight. Bursting off stage, he finds himself in a hallway of doors, each leading to a different set where authentic, post-spin, digitally engaged news analysis can be found. As he runs, he passes by the Rachel Maddow Show, the Joe Rogan Experience, Full Frontal with Samantha Bee, The Lead with Jake Tapper, the Mehdi Hassan Show, InfoWars, The Read Out with Joyanne Reid, Common Sense with Barry Weiss, and countless others. Paul Vanderklay Channel. Here it is. Far, far down at the forgotten end of the hall, he stops before a door that reads, The Problem with Jon Stewart, and pushes through. Then they go on to talk about Stewart's new show, The Problem with Jon Stewart. The irony was that in blowtorching TV journalism for having become just about TV, Stewart produced a decade of great TV journalism about TV. The show allowed its audience to stand above the fray, to dodge substantive politics and already identify with the conviction that they were the ones staying true to the spirit of America while the soulless media political hacks sold out and the fanatics went off the rails. Does that sound familiar? As Ross Douthat put it in 2010, he proved that he can conjure the thrill of a culture war without the cost of combat and the solidarity of identity politics without any actual politics. But Douthat was actually describing a different event, Glenn Beck's Restoring Honor rally, the one that Stewart and Colbert's rally had aimed to spoof. Many of the ingredients of these dueling rallies. Now again, how did Trump get elected? What was his main campaign engine? The rally. Begat. Stewart rolled out the carpet for Donald Trump. It's astounding. Through this, I haven't gotten the language yet, but it's personalized, idealized relevance realization through an avatar, through a personality. That's sort of the prism by which we can do this. I'll have to find that clip from Peugeot. Many of the ingredients of these dueling rallies, the stick it to the powers that be ethos, the insistence that there is a broad middle of the country who are on the side of the rallies and against the establishment, even the furious disputes about crowd size would be echoed a few years later in the rallies to make America great again. You can flatter your audience over and over every day by showing them proof of how insane the people they despise are becoming. You can tell them that they want to hear about how everyone else is just hearing what they want to hear. You can even build an entire new media business model on this. But how long can you tell your audience they're the only ones still living in reality before the idea just becomes an alternative reality of its own? The tragedy of it all is that it isn't just a nightmare version of the world Jon Stewart dreamed of. It's a world he built. In his quest to turn real news from the exception into the norm, he pioneered a business model that made it nearly impossible. It's a model of content production and audience catering perfectly suited to monetize alternate realities delivered to fragmented audience. It tells us what we want to hear and leaves us with the sense that they have departed for fantasy worlds while we have our heads on straight. Americans finally have what they didn't before. The phony theatrics have been destroyed and replaced not by an earnest new above-the-fray centrism. The monarchical vision is gone, folks. This is all part of the recession of modernity. But a more authentic fanaticism. And authenticity, of course, is the name of the god. Jon Stewart pioneered fake news in the hope that it would deliver us from the absurdities of the old media world. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams.